Why is the Rome of the Age of Kings and the early Republic remembered so much less than the early Empire? The heavy ideological legacy of the past? A conspiracy of historians? Reptiloids? The small scale of the events taking place? Probably the latter does have a place among everyday people, but also among historians. The topic of early Rome is not as popular as it could be. Why? One of the main points is that we still know too little reliably about Rome. Yes, we have Roman historians, especially Titus Livius, who described the history of the city from its very beginning. There is a fairly developed archaeology, but there is still no confirmation of much of what has been described. The very foundation of Rome is the subject of these doubts. The question of truthfulness of a legend about the basis of Rome by Romulus here already 200 years rages minds of scientists. The originator of the scramble became German historian Niebuhr, who in the work, Roman History, has irrefutably declared that all Roman sources on imperial period full of lies and late fictions. Among other things, he denied the reality of Romulus, considering his existence as folk legends, and the very foundation of the city he attributed to later times. The famous historian Theodore Mommsen also considered Romulus a late fake, not disputing the fact of the founding of the city somewhere in the middle of 8th century BC. Having as a basis for study only ancient testimonies of Roman and Greek historians and only nascent archaeology, such conclusions did not meet organized resistance. Moreover, if the 19th century shook the foundations of the story of Romulus, the beginning of the 20th century shook the legend of the founding of Rome itself. Archaeological data of the beginning of the 20th century testified that on the one hand settlements on Palatine and Calia existed before the legendary date, but on the other hand there was no evidence that before the 6th century BC. These settlements were united. The obvious conclusion was that Rome as a city was founded much later than the legendary date. And if Rome was founded later, Romulus couldn't have been. Added its might and studies of religious rites, which testified to the origin of the cult of Romulus, as the founder of the city, only in the IV century BC. It would seem, the myth is dispelled, and the impostor thrown off the top of historical knowledge. Hypercritics of the early 20th century were even more radical than Niebuhr, seeking to prove the fallacy of Livy's presentation of the history of not only royal Rome, but also up to 3 to 2 centuries BC. So, in their opinion, it is unlikely that the kings of Rome could rule each for almost 40 years, and there must have been more kings, and those 7 that are mentioned are a collective image. Conducting a comparative analysis of different periods of Rome, they argued that many events and characteristic personalities are repeated in the history of the city 2 or 3 or 4 times, and clearly interpolated by Livy from the present to the past. Moreover, some began to argue that perhaps there were no kings, and the city did not exist before the 4th century either. Do you hear that sound? It's the Fomenkovites knocking from below. But, large-scale rebuilding, reconstruction and, caused by them excavations, shook the position of hypercritics. Indeed, settlements on the Roman hills appeared long before the generally accepted date of the founding of the city, in 10 to 9 centuries BC. They were villages with wooden huts, mazonki, each adjoining a plot with a vegetable garden and or cattle yard, surrounded by a palisade for protection, which does not contradict the Roman evidence, which claimed that Romulus' wooden hut was honored and preserved by the Romans for many decades. The communities were divided, both by the lowlands between the hills and culturally. The Latins and Sabines, though Italic, considered each other outsiders. The settlements themselves looked like the reconstruction in Picture 1. Yes, these huts in the middle of the forest are the protorim. In the middle of the 8th century, according to archaeological data, there is a certain turning point, houses on stone foundations appear. Their very number grows, which indicates both the growth of the number of inhabitants and their well-being. The peculiarities of archaeological excavations in any large city do not allow you to dig where you want, and the period of mass reorganization of the city center ended with the departure of Duce. So we have to be satisfied only with point excavations to study the cultural layer. According to the results of such studies, there is reason to believe that by the end of the 8th century, the communities of at least two hills, Palatine and Calia, united. In addition, the first finds on the capital belong to the same period. There is evidence of the existence of a freestanding fortification, fortress, which partially confirms the data of Livy, as well as burials and possibly ritual structures. Probably a wall was also erected around the community of Palatine and Caelius. Thus it is possible to assert, without much tampering, that the 8th century BC was the beginning of the city of Rome, although it was still a large village. And only by the 6th century, together with the transition to stone houses, there was a unification of all the communities inhabiting the hills in the valley of the Tiber into a single body. Scholars have called this process synoikism, the merger of communities into a single polis, the visible result of which was the enclosure of the city with the so-called Servian Wall, after the king Servius Tullius. This wall was originally wooden, but by the IV century it was made of stone. The structure of the settlement also changed. The chaotically scattered courtyards were replaced by straight streets and squares, which is attributed to the Etruscan influence. Reconstruction of this period of city development is presented in Picture 2. And what about Romulus? Neither confirm nor deny his existence. Archaeology cannot. Source study for obvious reasons too, so modern science considers him a legend. So he didn't exist? Not at all. Probably, the story set forth in the legend has real grounds. As otherwise it is difficult to explain the sharp growth of the population of Rome since the end of the 8th century, except as mass migration to it of inhabitants of other settlements, that fits into the version of the legend. In any case, the establishment of royal authority was a common sign of social development of Latin communities, and if someone had to rule Rome at that time, why he should not be called Romulus. Opponents of the reality of Romulus really insist that to be called king to the governor of two villages somehow too fat. But these villages only for a century subjugated the district in radius of 10 kilometers. Another question is whether it is legitimate to speak about 7 kings. Today the majority of scientists do not doubt in existence of 5th king Tarquinius Priscus, Tarquinius Ancient, but here on his predecessors there are doubts. Formally already the 3rd Tsar Tulla Hostilius is considered most likely to exist, and the 2nd Numa Pompilius semi-legendary. That is, with probability much more than 0 it is possible to assert that it existed really. But at the same time, as to refute unequivocally their existence it is impossible. Then in any historical work you will not go anywhere from their mentioning as other czars of Rome at historians. For you there is no